think we're ready to get started. Our speaker for this morning's session is Professor Richard Swinburne, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Professor Swinburne.
Thank you. Before we investigate whether the biblical picture of God is a moral one, we need to investigate what the Bible means, and that's what this paper is about. But before we can do that, we need to consider some general questions about meaning, and so here goes. The meaning, in the wide sense of the truth conditions, of a token written sentence depends, firstly, on the conventions of the language in which it is written, and secondly, on the context of its inscription. By the conventions of the language, I mean just the conventions which determine how the meaning of the sentence is a function of the meaning of the individual words and the way in which they are put together. We need say no more about that. But context is important. The context of inscription includes literary, social, and cultural contexts. The literary context is the literary work of which the sentence forms a part. The social context is the context of its production, who wrote it, when, and for which audience. The cultural context is that of the common beliefs of the society in which and for which the literary work was written. The literary and social context together show us who is being referred to by any indexical expression and proper names. For example, which year is the one described as last year, or who is the John mentioned in the sentence? The cultural context shows us which literary genres were available to the authors. And I just insert a little bit about literary genres. Genres include both very newspaper-like history, I don't know an exact word for that, but the kind of work in which the truth of the whole work is a function of the truth of each sentence, and each sentence is expected to correspond to a particular fact. So if it says that so-and-so made a speech which said such and such has to be his actual words. That's the sort of extreme of a historical work. But then you have historical fables in which all that's required for the fable to be true is that the major players which it describes had certain goals and interacted with certain aims, but what they said when and who they met when is quite irrelevant to the truth of the fable. And then we have metaphysical fables, such as Plato's myth of the cave. You have moral fables, the only point of which is to describe a kind of conduct which it commends. We have allegories, we have philosophical dialogues, and so on. And rather important for the distinction between them is the extent to which the truth, if you can call it truth in the case of some of the allegories, in the sense that it depends. They vary in respect of how the truth of the whole depends on the truth of the individual sentences. Whether the individual sentences are true in an allegory or a metaphysical fable isn't to the point, but it's just how they put together that gives the truth to the whole. So, to take my own example, if you have a work of history in which a politician's speech is recorded, then whether that work's truth value is affected by whether the politician said there's actual words or not depends on the genre which the book is supposed to belong to. And if it's a work of history of a kind that Herodotus wrote, then it's nonetheless true for the politician not having said exactly those words, so long as something along those lines was correct. And the social and literary contexts are also crucial for distinguishing when words are being used in unusual and especially metaphorical senses. And crucial here is if an author writes something which, taken literally, is quite irrelevant to the surrounding sentences, or and or something he clearly doesn't believe and doesn't believe his readers believe, then it must be understood in an unusual sense. So, illustrating these points by a single sentence, Larry is an elephant. Before we can understand this sentence, we need to know not merely what the dictionary meanings of the words are and how they are put together, but the context. It may occur in a guide to a zoo, or a work of fiction intended for children, or a letter from a mother about the qualities of her son. These are alternative genres. Knowledge of the cultural context tells us which genres are available. In some societies, certain genres certainly aren't there. But knowledge of our own culture might tell us that zoo guides, children's fiction, letters are all available genres. When we know the literary context, that is, the literary work to which the sentence belongs, we can recognize the genre of that literary work. If the sentence is a sentence of a zoo guide, we still need to know the social context, for which zoo it was written and when, before we know what the sentence is telling us. If it was written for the London Zoo of 1950, then what the sentence is telling us is that Larry, an animal in that zoo, is an elephant. The truth conditions of the sentence are then clear, but only when we know all three contexts. If there was an animal, and once the truth conditions of the sentence are clear, then if there was an animal called Larry in London Zoo in 1950 who was an elephant, the sentence is true. If there was such an animal but he wasn't an elephant, the sentence is false. If we, on the other hand, recognize that the literary work to which this sentence belongs is a work of children's fiction, then the sentence is surely neither true nor false. But if the whole work to which the sentence belongs has a clear moral or metaphysical message, we may say that the whole work is true, insofar as that message is true, and false insofar as it's not. If, thirdly, the sentence occurs in an ordinary letter from a human mother writing about her son, then it clearly cannot be understood literally, because we know, and we know the mother knows, that the son isn't literally an elephant. It must be taken metaphorically. It must be ascribing to the son some feature possessed or believed to be possessed by elephants, for example, being large and strong with a good memory. And then it will be true or false insofar as the context makes it clear which feature is being ascribed, and if it is clear, insofar as the son has that feature. So much for general principles. Section 2. The Bible is a big book, composed of many smaller books, most of them woven together out of yet smaller strands of writing, themselves being formed of smaller units, each with a different literary context and a different social context and a different cultural context at each stage of its inscription. Many sentences will therefore have several different meanings, arising from the fact that the sentence belongs to several different units, the smallest unit being a part of a larger unit which belongs to a yet larger unit, and so on. Such a sentence will therefore have one meaning as a sentence of one larger unit and a different meaning as a member of a yet larger unit, and so on. And you have many of the different genres to which I've referred and several other genres in the Bible. So let's begin by going back to the smallest units, the bits of poetry and story and oracle from various sources from which the Bible was put together. For example, Isaiah 7:14 in the Hebrew says, quote, "A young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel." The original literary context is clearly that of Isaiah 7:7-17. The original literary context of the original pericope in which this appeared. The social context seems to be that of a speech of Isaiah to King Ahaz, which the cultural context shows to be a prophecy. So, the sentence says that the queen, or perhaps Isaiah's wife, will bear a son who will symbolize God's presence with his oppressed people. Or, another example, in Daniel 12, 1-2, an angel prophesies an end of the world after the death of a king whose anti-Jewish activities are described in the second half of chapter 11. Historical scholarship shows fairly convincingly that this chapter was written by an unknown writer in the 2nd century AD, and that the king described in chapter 11 was King Antiochus IV. So, the original author reported a prophecy which subsequently turned out to be false. So, there's two examples of sentences who had a small location in a 10-verse unit and a certain meaning deriving from that 10-verse unit, from the literary context of that unit, from the social context of who wrote it, and from the cultural context of available genres, such as prophecy. The units were put together by compilers with the aid of connecting verses into larger units, such as the J, E, D, and P sources of the Pentateuch, and these were then put together into the books of the Hebrew Bible, and finally the Hebrew Bible was incorporated into the Christian Bible as the Old Testament.